There are crimes, and then there are patterns. A single act of violence shocks a community, but repeated violence, carried out in silence, over months, sometimes years, creates something far more powerful than shock. It creates fear. Fear that spreads through neighborhoods, fear that keeps people awake at night, fear that turns ordinary streets into places of suspicion and dread. Serial killers operate differently from other criminals. They don't simply act once and disappear. They repeat their crimes. They refine their methods. They learn how to avoid detection. Sometimes they appear completely ordinary. A neighbor, a coworker, a volunteer in the community, someone who blends perfectly into daily life. That is what makes these cases so disturbing, because while communities were living their normal lives, danger was moving quietly among them. Tonight we examine 10 documented serial killers. Real names, real investigations, real victims. This is not about glorifying violence. It is about understanding the cases that forced investigators, psychologists, and law enforcement agencies to rethink how they track violent offenders. Many of these crimes changed the way police investigate patterns. They pushed the development of forensic science. They led to the creation of criminal profiling. Stay with me, because number 1 changed the way law enforcement hunts killers forever. Let's begin. Number 10. Aileen Wuornos. 1989 and 1990, Aileen Wuornos murdered 7 men in Florida. She targeted middle-aged men while working as a sex worker along highways. Wuornos would enter the vehicles of strangers. Then, during isolated moments on the road, she shot her victims at close range. The crimes shocked investigators because of their unusual pattern. At the time, female serial killers were extremely rare in criminal records, and Wuornos' case quickly attracted national attention. Wuornos claimed the killings were acts of self-defense. She argued that the men had attempted to assault her and that she had acted to protect herself. Investigators, however, concluded the murders were intentional homicides tied to robbery and escalating violence. Her background was deeply troubled. She experienced severe childhood abuse, abandonment, and homelessness. Her early life included violence, instability, and survival on the margins of society. During the trial, psychologists debated whether her traumatic past had influenced her actions, but ultimately the court found her responsible for the murders. Wuornos was convicted and later executed in 2002. Shock fact: during recorded interviews before her execution, Wuornos openly expressed hatred toward humanity, statements that continue to disturb investigators and psychologists studying the case. Number 9. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez became known as the Night Stalker. Between 1984 and 1985, he terrorized California with a series of brutal home invasions. Ramirez entered houses late at night while residents were sleeping. His victims ranged widely in age, from children to elderly adults. There was no clear pattern in who he chose. Some victims were attacked with guns. Others were assaulted with knives or blunt objects. The randomness of the crimes created widespread panic. People across California began locking windows, installing alarms, and purchasing firearms for protection. Media coverage intensified public fear as the manhunt continued. Ramirez left disturbing symbols and messages at several crime scenes, adding to the sense of unpredictability surrounding the case. Eventually, investigators were able to identify him through forensic evidence and public tips. He was captured in 1985 after citizens recognized him from media coverage. Shock fact: during his trial, Ramirez raised his hand to display a pentagram drawn on his palm and expressed allegiance to satanic imagery, shocking everyone in the courtroom. Number 8. Jeffrey Dahmer. Between 1978 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 17 young men and boys. His crimes remained hidden for years inside a quiet apartment building in Milwaukee. Dahmer targeted vulnerable individuals, often meeting them in public places before luring them back to his apartment. Once there, the crimes escalated into disturbing acts involving control and manipulation. Investigators later discovered that Dahmer attempted experiments meant to keep victims submissive and dependent. When police finally entered his apartment in 1991, they uncovered one of the most disturbing crime scenes in modern American history. Evidence included photographs, preserved remains, and other materials that documented the extent of his crimes. The discovery shocked the public and raised serious questions about missed warning signs. In one earlier incident, police had briefly encountered Dahmer but did not realize the danger he posed. The case became a major example in discussions about how law enforcement handles suspicious situations and missing person reports. Shock fact: investigators investigators found human remains stored inside ordinary household containers in Dahmer's apartment, a discovery that stunned even experienced detectives. If you're still watching, subscribe now, because the next cases reveal how ordinary appearances can hide extraordinary darkness. Number 7. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was widely described as intelligent, charming, and well-spoken. He studied law and appeared to be building a successful future. But during the 1970s, Bundy murdered at least 30 women across multiple states. Investigators believe the real number may be higher. Bundy often approached victims by pretending to be injured. He used crutches or a fake cast to appear vulnerable. When someone offered to help him carry books or items to his car, he would abduct them. Bundy's ability to appear trustworthy made him especially dangerous. He was arrested multiple times and even managed to escape custody during the investigation. His trial became a media spectacle as Bundy chose to represent himself in court. Shock fact: while committing murders, Bundy volunteered at a crisis hotline, presenting himself as compassionate and helpful while secretly living a double life. Number 6. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy lived what appeared to be a normal life in suburban Chicago. He owned a construction business and was active in local community events. He even performed as a clown named Pogo at children's parties and charity functions. But between 1972 and 1978, Gacy murdered at least 33 young men. Many of his victims were buried beneath his house. Neighbors reported strange smells coming from the property, but the true cause remained hidden for years. When police finally investigated the home thoroughly, the discovery was horrifying. Investigators began excavating the crawl space beneath the house. One by one, bodies were uncovered. Shock fact: the discovery of multiple victims buried under Gacy's home shocked even veteran investigators accustomed to violent crime scenes. Number 5. Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei Chikatilo operated in the Soviet Union between 1978 and 1990. He murdered at least 52 women and children. The investigation into his crimes was complicated by limited forensic resources and political pressures within the Soviet system. Authorities struggled to identify a clear suspect. At one point, an innocent man was wrongfully convicted and executed before Chikatilo was eventually captured. Chikatilo used public transportation to travel between locations, making his movements difficult to track. He often targeted vulnerable individuals in remote areas. Shock fact: Chikatilo sometimes attended public gatherings related to the investigations, blending into crowds searching for the killer. Number 4. Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader gave himself the nickname BTK, which stood for Bend, Torture, Kill. He murdered 10 people between 1974 and 1991, but Rader's crimes were unique because he actively communicated with media and police. He sent letters describing his actions and demanded attention for his crimes. For years, he lived a normal life while the case remained unsolved. He worked as a compliance officer and was involved in his church community. Then in 2004, Rader began contacting authorities again, seeking recognition. Shock fact: Rader was finally identified through metadata on a floppy disk he sent to police, believing it could not be traced. Number 3. Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway became known as the Green River Killer. He murdered at least 49 women in Washington state, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in US history. Most of his victims were vulnerable sex workers. Ridgway avoided capture for decades by carefully hiding evidence and choosing isolated locations. Eventually, advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to link him to the crimes. Shock fact: Ridgway reportedly returned to some crime scenes long after the murders, a behavior that deeply disturbed investigators studying the case. Number 2. Pedro Lopez. Pedro Lopez operated across several South American countries during the 1970s. He confessed to killing over 100 young girls. Authorities eventually convicted him of 110 murders in Ecuador. His crimes targeted impoverished communities where disappearances often received less immediate attention. Shock fact: after serving the maximum sentence of 14 years at the time, Lopez was released and later disappeared from public record. Before we reveal number 1, comment "Facts Matter," because this final case reshaped criminal investigation history. 1. Jack the Ripper. In 1888, an unidentified killer began murdering women in London's Whitechapel district. The victims were women living in poverty. The crimes involved disturbing mutilations that shocked Victorian society. Media coverage intensified public fear as the killer continued to evade capture. Letters claiming to be from the murderer were sent to newspapers and police, signed Jack the Ripper. Despite a massive investigation involving hundreds of officers and suspects, the killer was never identified. Shock fact, the case played a major role in the development of modern criminal profiling techniques and investigative methods. These were real crimes, real victims, real consequences. Cases like these remind us why forensic science, investigation techniques, and criminal profiling continue to evolve. Every advancement in law enforcement comes from studying the past and learning from the mistakes that allowed crimes to continue undetected. Which case shocked you the most? What should Topify investigate next? This is Topify. Thank you for watching. See you next time.